We are recording.
Excellent. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is, so we know how we can make kind of quite simple objects in Voyager and Designer. I'm just going to show you now how you'd go to actually start getting some complexity and start building other things. So rather than just having your, kind of straight sphere or your straight cube or whatever, to put more complex things together, and also have a look at some of the other ways that you can build objects aside from just using the primitive solids. But first of all, I'm just going to talk about how you can start to combine the solids together, because this is a really good way of just starting to build things simply. And it's really probably the way that you build anything that's kind of even complex. So if you've seen things like my hot air balloon or the Zeppelin, they're essentially built like this. They're essentially built from various kinds of solids or various kinds of objects that you can do added together. It really is that same thing that we looked at in the early ArtMatic Designer thing, where we were just kind of adding objects together to get more complex objects. It's exactly the same when you're using DF objects, except you're working in 3D. So first of all, what I've got up here is, so this should look pretty familiar. This is the sphere that we had when we started on these simple objects, and there's also a cube added to it now. So we'll go into the DF, oopsie, wrong one. I'm looking at the plane, have to make sure the right thing's selected here. This is called Simple Sphere because it's basically the same system I was using before, but I've just added a cube to it. And when we look at it inside of Designer, we can see that there's, there's two things here. There's the sphere, which is in this side, and here we've got the box or the cube. And the thing that I put up in the top above the cube here is just basically a way of moving it in 3D space, so we can just move it away from where the sphere is. And now we're going to start talking about the ways that we can put these things together. Excuse me. And there are a few ways of doing it. I mean, you can actually mix them in other ways, but the way that I most like to do it is using the logic tools, because the logic tools, one reason I like them is because they're kind of familiar to most people, because logic tools are often used to create shapes. And if you've used Bryce, you know how the logic tools work, but many other apps use logic tools to combine things. It's just using what we call Boolean logic. And if we look in here, you can kind of see the sorts of ways that you can actually cause the logic tool to relate to the two objects, whatever they should be. Of course, you can have any two objects in here. We're just joining a cube and a sphere at the moment, and I've used the default logic setting, which is max blend and union, max and blend and union, which is basically kind of using both the full maximum of each of the DF objects and joining them together. In this particular case, they're not joined because they're actually sitting apart from one another, because I've moved them. So what I'll do here is I'm just going to move them together so they're actually touching. So I'm going to move so basically just moving the offset of the cube on the X dimension, and you'll see that they are now touching in Voyager. And the reason that I want to do that is to show you that you can, at the moment, it's just basically a cube and a sphere, and they're overlapping one another, and that's fine. But you can actually relate them to one another using different kinds of techniques. In this first tile, you have a few things that you can tweak around, and one of them is smoothness, and that is how smooth the join between the two things is. And so if we wind up the smoothness, you can see that the two things now kind of blur into one another. You can also cause a difference in the way that the blending happens in these things. That's easiest understood if you play with them, but it's basically it's looking at the whole overarching kind of idea of the two objects, and it's kind of making an extrapolation of the space. Depending which way you go, you'll see the space is distorted in different ways. And then if you use a combination of that with the smoothing, you're starting to get an object which actually looks sort of like it's it's kind of its own object. It's a thing in itself. I'm just rotating that around so you can have a look at it there. Straight away, you can see that this is, now we have an object which is not really a cube or a sphere. It's kind of a combination of both of those things. And that's starting you on your way to kind of meld things together and create from what is basically, you know, one object into, two objects into one object. And of course, you can keep on adding those things. You can keep on adding shapes to do that. And as you offset them, you'll have different kinds of effects. So I'll just take the logic tool back to its preset, to its defaults again, and take the smoothness down here. Default. I'm going to show you just some of the other ways these two things can be joined together. So instead of just having, let's just reset this as well. Instead of just having the logic tool relate to the maximum of the two things, I'm going to now look at the minimum of the two things, which means that it basically is where the two things, it's kind of like, I think it's very close to intersect, in fact. It's exactly the same. So it's basically looking at the overlap of the two objects here, and it's taking the difference between them and where they both intersect one another and giving you that shape. So straight away, you can see that this is a really good way of you know, punching out a piece from something. So, and getting a very interesting object, you know, like this can be very complicated depending on the way that you, the two objects you have or the three objects you have. And obviously the more objects you have together, the more complicated this kind of thing will be. Let's just go into subtract. And in this particular case, what happens is the Y input is subtracted from the X input. And this means that the cube is now subtracting from the sphere. And this is a really good way of making negative spaces within your object. So if you have, you know, like a very small, well, let's make our cube a little smaller here. Let's try 0.3. We can't see it, so let's just go back into the Mac so we can see the cube. And I'm going to just move it into the sphere a little bit here. And then I'll go back into the subtract. Subtract is very useful because you kind of end up using it quite a lot. And you'll see here it's just taken, it's chopped the cube out of the sphere. We just need to rotate it a little bit so we can see that. Go the other direction. Going every direction around except where I want it to be. You can see there that the cube has now been kind of chopped out of the sphere. Now, you'll probably straight away kind of start thinking, well, you can do this with any sets of DF objects or even noises and surfaces and patterns. So you can actually take something and subtract that from the other thing. You can take it and you can add it to the other thing. There are many options here. So straight away, you should be able to see you can get quite complex shapes doing this kind of stuff. I'm just going to put the cube back to its full size. Now you can see it's just kind of taken the whole face off. And I'll reset this. And look at some of the other things that you have in here. You can do things like, you can have the two things joined together with a chisel surface, which gives you like a little bevel. And chisel can be also on the intersect, and it can also be as the subtract. And you have various kinds of other ways of joining these things together. Mostly the best way of, again, of figuring out how these things work is to play with them. In this particular case, we've got a ripple thing. We have to give that a bit more. It's basically causing the object to ripple as it joins, and depending on the factors here, you can see the ripples, ripple period. Bit hard to see just here, but you can kind of see it's doing odd ripply things as it joins. Again, these things will depend on the shapes that you're using to do this. They can be quite varied according to what kind of shapes you're doing this with. But that's part of the fun, of course, because, you know, if you use these kinds of different sorts of ways of joining things together or subtracting from one thing and another thing, can give you such an enormous variety of different forms and effects that really there's no way of explaining them easily. You just have to try it. You have to just kind of go, I'm going to give that a go and see where it leads me. So that's a very good way of just very simply joining things together. And you can, of course, keep on joining as many things together as you wish, just by adding new versions and just summing them with another logic tool. You can join two things together in a max way and then subtract something from it. So you can have, we could actually have, you know, a second object here, let's say, and put in another logic tool down here. Join it to here, put a logic tool in, and we could do something where we're adding two things together and subtracting something from them. It's a bit wacky, but you can kind of see what will happen if I made this one into a subtract here. Well, let's go intersect. It's not intersecting because it's way too big. So let's make it 8.5. And so what's happening there is we have a torus which is subtracting from the sum of the cube and the sphere. So it doesn't really take a lot to see that you can actually make pretty much any shape you want by using these kinds of methods. You just need to kind of persevere. What I'm going to go to next is, so that's just basically on the basic shapes. There's no coloring in there at all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to oopsie, let's go back into Voyager. I'm going to look at the same thing, but this time with two color objects. Let's look at the objects. So in this particular case, I have two objects joined together, and they are joined by a different kind of logic tool, but it's basically doing the same thing. This is a logic tool that allows us to join not only the shapes, but also the colors and the alpha channels. And so what's happening here is I've got a green shape and I've got a blue shape. Now I'm going to explain something that I saw that, well, you may have seen in Paul's tutorial if you were watching that, which I neglected to actually explain last time when I was talking about these things. He's done a very simple thing here when he's colored an object, and he's basically just added this component to the object at the end to color it. So that gives you a very simple colored object. That's a very easy way of making something a solid color if you want to do that. The reason that I didn't do that when I did my tutorial is this. So that's the way he did it in his tutorial. That's basically making a green circle. That's a perfectly legit way of doing it. The reason that I did it this other way is because this way teaches you how to use the RGBs and makes you think about what's happening. So if you do it this way, you can kind of understand what's going on. You've got an object here. You have a 1 in 4 out tile here, which is containing the color and the object. And it's packed here to go into the thing. You don't need the packing to do it. You just need that, and you'll get a colored object. It's essentially the same as this, except the only difference is the color is coming in independently of the object. It's not attached to the object. Here, the object itself is just going to be green no matter what. Here, we can swap this tile out really easily with something to produce color. So we could stick one of these in and we would get color straight away. And that's the reason that I did it the way that I showed you in the earlier tutorials, because it teaches you that the color comes in independently of the object. And it means you can swap this tile out. You can have a solid color in there quite easily, but you can swap it out with any of the color tools as well. And it gives you control over what color is actually being applied to your object. Just in case that was confusing if you watched Steve's tutorial. So here we have two color objects being joined together. And the reason that I've done this is to show you this variety of logic tools. So these logic tools are actually doing pretty much what you saw in that last example with just the two DF objects. But in this case, they're containing color. So you have to use something that actually will mix the colors as well. And so what I've done here is I have the object, it's going through the color, and then it's being packed into the logic tool on either side. And this logic tool doesn't have quite as many, oh, it has nearly as many. Again, various ways that you can actually join these two things together. So let's just move our cube across. Oopsie, not that far. Just to explain too, I think I've explained this before, but if you hold down the Option key when you're using these sliders, things will happen slower. So when you saw me grab it the first time with this thing, it goes pretty quickly. And so if you want to make it a little slower, just hold the Option key down and it will, and you can drag and it will actually drag a lot slower, a lot more accuracy. So you can see there we have two objects now joined together, but they're different colors. And we have now ways of actually changing the kind of ways that the colors will actually join together. So here the colors will kind of blur together, and you can change how that works, whether you take a lot of the A input or a lot of the B input with your two colors. Now, of course, if you do have something like another, let's go back to our 3 and 3 out here and put in one of these things, the same thing will happen. The colors are actually blurred across the two objects. Once more, this is a really great way of getting sort of really nice, complex ideas happening together without too much trouble. And you can get just joining a couple of objects together with different kinds of colors on them and blurring them together with this tool can give you some pretty interesting shapes and pretty interesting objects. And you can also add textures to this as well. I'm not going to do that. We talked about that last week, but again, there's another level of complexity that you can kind of pop on top of that by adding, you know, some textures on one side and not on the other side. And of course, the textures will blend together as well. Should be pretty easy to see that you can get some pretty spectacular and interesting shapes doing this. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to look at, pop in with questions if you want with any of these things. I'm going to look at the, actually, no, I won't do that one this time. First of all, we'll look at the DF curves. So you've probably seen this particular function. It's the DF curves function. It's this one. It's relatively new to Voyager. And it allows you to actually kind of rotate something through 360 degrees to define certain kinds of objects. There are some kind of things that pop in here as defaults, like a wine glass and a bottle. So if you want to get a quick bottle or something like that, that's a good way of doing that. But there's also a bunch of a really kind of unusual starting points too. So you can just put in a cubic. Oops, let's just go back in here and tilt down again. Cubic curve, which you can change various aspects of, different kinds of phases of, to again, it's sitting underneath the plane here too. I'll just move the altitude of the elevation of the plane down a little bit here. Just down again. I think my camera's pretty high here, so. Let's see. And any of these things, you're basically kind of revolving them in 3 dimensions. It's kind of like lathing them around to give you even more possibilities of making complex shapes. And just to even kind of make it even more interesting, you can take the shape that you're using here. I'm just using a disk here. So what it's doing, it's kind of taking a disk and then swirling it around in 3D space. But you can pop in anything you like here, and it will do the same thing with that. Let's just go into something a little more simple here. These things, again, you know, you can get very complex with what you're doing here. So things will look very different according to which combination of things you use here. So I'm using, at the top here, I'm using a Persian arch. Let's go to a column. Doesn't look that much different. But depending on which of these things you actually use to flip it around, you'll get different effects. So here, I think, again, you can see this is a very, very good and quick way to get quite complex shapes. And we're still only in essentially very, very simple DF shapes here. We haven't even gone to the next level of complexity. So let's look at, so any questions with that? I'm sure you've come across this already, I guess, if you've played in Voyager. Set up this system, if you can grab a screenshot of this, just set up this system like that, and then just play with these two components. Just plug something, one of these things in here, and then try doing a different thing with the way that you rotate it through space here. And then you have all of these kinds of things as well that you can play with to try and change how it looks. So this, just doing this, just playing with this will give you hours worth of exploration as to what kinds of things you can do. Very, very simple way of getting very complex and quite lovely shapes.
You also added a mirror tile.
Well, I'm kind of restraining myself from saying that because yes, and we'll get onto that in a little bit. because right at the moment, I'm just looking at the shapes themselves. I'm not even showing you how we can then go on to the next step, which is distorting these shapes in space, which we'll look at in a sec. I'm going to bring up, let's just go to the, oh, and obviously, again, you can color these things in any particular way that you want. At the moment, that's the wine glass again, but because the shape, the basic shape that I've used to rotate it through is a kind of a different shape, it's now looking like a little four-sided chalice. So you can see that really quickly, you get a really different look here. I do want to talk about some of these kinds of ways of looking at things. Right now you can see this thing is just colored very simply. It's just got a simple kind of light bluish color on it. We can change it to anything we want, really. But it's also got a mirror surface on it. So it's actually reflecting. Now, I'm sure you've come across this idea. And this is that when we're in the DF object here, we have the ability to kind of select some reflection and some speculation. And we have the kind of way that the shader will work as well. I'm not going to talk about these just yet. We may do that in the next lesson. For most DF objects, you want to start on volumetric opaque, which is basically saying it's a solid object. In this particular case, I've stuck a little bit of reflection on it as well. And that's just by dragging up and down on this little side thing here. If I take it right down, it will just be solid and have no reflection. And we also have the ability to set speculation and so forth, but let's not talk about that just yet. I'm going to pull up the very next of these things, which is profile sweep. Okay, so now this is a sort of similar thing, what's going on here. This is what we call a profile sweep tile. Let's look at this. And it's this tile here. So what this does, it allows you to take something and, again, rotate it in 360 degrees. So we have an object sitting underneath it here, and we have the ability to rotate it. Just ignore these noise tiles for the moment. I'm going to show you something with those in a minute. But this tile here looks at this tile. Again, this is the one that allows you to have lots of different basic forms you can work with. So you can swap them out for anything and it will just rotate them through 360 degrees. If you offset this particular tile here underneath the rotation, it'll have different effects, or you can change directly from inside the tile. You can change its width and its height and so forth. But let's stick just for fun, we'll stick an offset tile in here. So we'd be, not that one, this one. Here we'd be offsetting it in different ways. And you can see it's essentially offsetting the tile itself underneath the rotation. So that's being rotated with an offset. And that'll give you some different kinds of ways of looking at it as well. I'll get rid of that one. But it kind of should become obvious that what you can now do is that you can have all kinds of ways of distorting the original object, and that too will then get rotated. So I put in a noise tile here. I've got its amplitude set at 0 at the moment, but I'm going to wind it up and I'll show you what happens when you distort the object underneath with some noise and then rotate it. Now we're getting an object that looks very kind of malleable and soft and has some contours. And the phase of that will actually determine what it looks like. So once again, you can see there's a lot of possibilities in doing this kind of thing. Let's just go back to our column here. And I'll take its height down a little bit. So this would be a good way of kind of making a column, of course. That's kind of what it's there for, but you don't need to stick with whatever that happens to say. You can make all kinds of things with this shape. Then, of course, if we stick a tile above that tile, we're actually now manipulating the whole object as well. So I put a noise tile above it here, and I can start to interfere with its complete shape and change the phase of that. You know, it's stuck in the plane a little bit here. Let's switch the shadows on. And I'll just move it up a bit. So again, so now we're getting into very, very complex and organic looking objects. We can do some pretty funky things with that. So one of the things that I think I told you when we were talking about the face system that I had up before is that the faces all had this kind of overarching distortion to them in a very, very mild way, but it gives you that kind of off symmetry thing that starts to make your objects look less kind of manufactured and a little bit more realistic. So the noises are really good to keep in mind for that sort of thing. You'll see that this is a 3D noise, so the noise is actually running in 3 dimensions. This is a 2D noise underneath it here, which is only manipulating this object in 2 dimensions. But because it's being lathed around in 3 dimensions, it's going to be a 3-dimensional object in the end. And then we go to that next step that Steve was hinting at, and that is we can actually now stick something else to manipulate the space above that, like a mirror tile. And so we have the 3-dimensional mirror tiles, various kinds of 3-dimensional mirrors and distorts. Let's put one of those in there. When you get to working with mirrors, of course, some of the object is not within the field of the mirror. So this has been popped quite a long way in. So we have to move it out a little bit. I think if I go this way, that might work. Yeah, so we're actually now moving our mirror out. We can move too far and it'll all disappear, which is what I did then. And we can also change, let's just put that back to default. We can also change the orientation of the mirror here. So that might make a difference as to how much of the thing actually is actually mirrored here, and in what way. But because you're not actually seeing all of the object when you use a mirror, that can actually get very, very confusing as to where you are. It does require a little bit of playing around to get this. So now I have the object is mirrored on a different axis. And if I, let's just put some rotation in here. And we'll just rotate it a little bit. You can see it's mirrored that strange shape we had here on a different axis, but it's given us a very interesting looking shape that we could play with. So you can see that's quite a complex shape. It would take you a long time to model such a shape in a conventional 3D app. If I start playing with the phase here, this will change the phase of the object and probably make it look different. No, not so much. Don't really know why. Certainly if I change this one, it will though. You can see this is a really good way of getting relatively complex things happening. Of course, you know, changing the mirror rotations and things like that. At the moment, we've got a 6-fold mirror, but we've got lots of different kinds of mirrors that we can use to get different kinds of shapes. Just a brilliant way of actually getting really complex and interesting shapes. And of course, this becomes an object now as well. So it's possible to have this object sitting there, and we can, let's just make this into a new. By the way, what I just did then is I should explain these things. I'm selecting the top tile. I am now shift selecting the bottom tile, and you'll see all the tiles in between go blue. And if I hit the N key, I will now get a new compiled tree. So that means that what we just saw there is now inside this tree. And it's going down to the color there. We could actually have the color inside that compiled tree as well. But what I'm going to do is just show you something where I'm going to get one of those simple DF shapes again, and I'm going to join it together up here with a logic tool. Just select those logic tools we had. And now what I have is a circle here, or a sphere. And I'm just make its radius a little bit bigger. Whoopsie, maybe not that quite that big. So here I've joined a sphere to that strange object that we had. So now we have an even more complex object, and I can then take that and make a little bit of smoothness on it. And we have an object which is really quite different to what we started with. These are really great ways of creating quite complex and interesting shapes inside of Voyager. There are even more possibilities here when you start to do things like subtracting some of the noise components, adding textures, and so forth. So you can get more and more and more and more complicated with these things. It's just a matter of doing this, the exact same thing that I've done here, adding these things together or subtracting them. Let's just for fun, we will put in a noise component of some kind. I'm going to try, I have to move this a bit. I think that might be hiding things. That was the problem we had last week. See, now that the windows are hiding some of the select menus. So I'm going to take 3D texture here, and I'm going to subtract that texture from this object. So from the whole object, I could subtract it from any of the parts of the object if I wanted to. So let's go to in here, do this. It's looking pretty kind of ugly there. I'm going to put in the logic tool. And I'm going to select this to subtract. These kinds of things you need a lot of fiddling around with. So we'll take the blend right down. Actually, no, I need to select it to 0. There's our object. So we're not getting any blend at all between these two things, no subtraction whatsoever. And with very small values, this will have a fairly profound effect. So let's try 0.1. So it's subtracting the texture from the whole object. That's too much. So let's try 0.05. And in this case, you can see that whole object that I had in before, let's try 0.02. It's now being textured with that 3D texture. I've basically subtracted the 3D texture from the surface of that complex object, and now we have something that, you know, looks a little bit like some kind of alien pod or something. Very fast to get to that kind of result, just by using these just very, very simple techniques of joining things together and either subtracting or adding or whatever. Of course, I can do this exact same thing with colored versions if I wanted to, with just using the different kinds of colored tiles that we saw in the last system. So, you know, I could have had that sphere as being a purple sphere and the rest of it being green. I could have just used this tile and subtracted it from only the first shape and not the second shape. It's just a matter of, you know, bringing these things together in ways that you find interesting and creative. So that's just a really quick tour of some of the ways you can make really complex objects. We haven't really talked about fractal objects and things. We might leave those for a little while. And the next thing that I really want to go on to talking about is the lighting tools and the different kinds of ways that we can light things. But are there any questions from you guys so far on what we're just looking at there with just basic object building? Does that all make sense?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. One thing I would ask is, it seems to be very quick at rendering. So no matter how complex these are, they're pretty fast.
Yeah, mostly. I mean, when you're using these depth field shapes and you're not kind of adding too much to them, they are pretty fast. But the thing you should remember is that certain kinds of things start to have a toll on the render. One of those things is noise. So noise is quite complex. And when you start using 3D noise in things, depending on how you use it, it can start to eat away at your render time. Just because there's a lot more calculations when you're using a noise function. But when you're using any of those kind of first things that I showed you, if you're using just the sweep tools or the just joining together with the logic tools, that stuff is pretty quick. Even the mirror tools. So one thing to think about is if you're making something that's symmetrical, think about, you don't have to model the entire symmetry of something. You can actually just model half of it and have it flipped symmetrically. So think about things like that, because that saves render time as well. So if you look at something like the hot air balloon file, for instance, you'll see that there's a lot of mirrors being used in there, because when you get one segment of something, if you want it to look like 8 segments or 12 segments, you just mirror it that way. You don't have to model each of the segments of something. Something like my Zeppelin is basically absolutely symmetrical in 2 dimensions. So I'd only have to build one engine or 2 engines on it and then flip that, and I've got 2 engines on the other side as well. So and that becomes the same with animation. So if you mirror something and you wanted to do something like animate the propellers on the Zeppelin, if it's mirrored, you only have to animate one side, because the other side will actually be mirrored and it will do anything that the other side does. So animation can actually it can save you time if you think carefully about how you're going to put something together. If there's symmetry involved and you only need to animate one half of the symmetry, then it saves you a lot of time in trying to do something. And a lot of things are symmetrical. I mean, you find that human creatures, most creatures are symmetrical in some way or other. A lot of mechanical stuff is symmetrical. So if you look at most of Eric's spacecraft, they're symmetrical, and there'll be a symmetry tile there making the symmetry of both sides. So symmetry is a very useful thing for doing that kind of stuff. You will find as you get further and further into building things, so the more complex your things become, the more the render will start to kind of come into play. When you start texturing things and when you start adding color textures and things like that, especially the noise textures, they will actually start to eat into render time to a certain degree, because they're just intensive functions. And also some of the distance field objects themselves, some, especially when you get into the jitter objects and things like that, they can be a little intense on the render as well, depending on what they are. But yeah, things render pretty quickly in simple objects like this. Also, the other thing that will have an effect on your render is when you introduce different kinds of shaders. So all our shaders for our objects are here. And you can see there are different ways of shading objects. So some of these things will actually render slower. So if you add, say, the translucent effect to things, oops, that was the plane. We don't want to transmute. Well, you could see then it took a long time to actually do that. But let's go in here and we'll add the translucent to this. Takes a little longer to do the render. They're simple objects, so it's pretty fast, but it takes a little longer. If you add reflections to things, they will take longer because it has to do more calculations. And the more complex your object becomes, the more, and you add reflection to it, the longer the render will be because it has to calculate more reflections if you do that kind of thing.
Going back to in a previous session, you were talking about how with DF objects, you got to get the scaling right.
Yeah.
So was these simple sort of things? Where is it in the trees that you're using there that the scaling becomes particularly crucial?
Well, scaling is one of those things where it can rear its ugly head in many ways. The first place that people actually tend to kind of come a cropper with scaling is when they apply some kind of space distortion. So let's just do that and I'll show you. So everyone gets very excited and they decide what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in, sorry, I'm just going to move this again. I'm going to put in something like Fractal Displace up here with my objects, and I really love that. So I'm going to whack the amplitude right up. Straight away, you're running into scaling problems. Not so much with this one actually, but you can kind of see it happening there. See when I change the amplitude, it's those little vertical stripes that appear when it tries to do the render there. It's pushing the scaling. It's not so bad actually, it's pretty contained here. I can see it. So you get a feel for it when you know what to look for in the system, but this one looks pretty okay, really. It's not kind of bending the scaling too much. If I was using, let me see if I can force it. It's one of those things like you come across it all the time, except when you really want to force it to happen. Let's just try the Perlin one and see what that does. It's done something wacky there. May not be an appropriate tile there. One place you definitely see it is in your system if you have, let's just see. I'll see if I can do it actually.
It's more likely to be up in the space distortion area.
Yeah, it's easier in the two input tiles because they have these complex tiles in them, and these can, straight away that's scaled very badly. I mean, that's not even going to render. You see Voyager's doesn't even know what to do with that, and we've got our little spinning ball there. That's a bad sign. It's because there I just forced. In fact, Voyager is still hung up on that because it really just pushed the scaling into intolerable levels. It just didn't know how. It doesn't know how to deal with it. It's usually not that extreme. I'd go pop that one in there, but it's still really having trouble with that. There we go. It finally decided, okay, I'm happy to go back to normal now. But that was because that tile it's got a lot of, it's a complex tile, and it forced the fields, the distance fields into like very extreme levels, and then it just can't do the calculations because it doesn't make sense to it. So trying to think of, so scaling, the main problem that you will have with scaling is if you try to make these objects too large in some way or other, it's a bit hard to explain. You know, I think the best thing to do is we'll just keep on going. At some point, we'll run into a scaling problem, and then I can talk about it, because I can't actually force it to go into a scaling problem here. You'll certainly see it once you start working in 3D fractals, because it's very, very easy to misscale 3D fractals in one way or another. And I'll do a whole thing about fractals, because the fractals are really worth exploring, but they're a little way down the track yet, I think. So let's just forget it for the moment. When we get to a system where it's pertinent, I'll show it to you. And some of the ways that you can control it. Sometimes it's not controllable too. The other thing too is you can actually push systems well out of whack, and there's really no way to correct with them and still preserve. So I often see people will post up something and say, you know, this is really great. And you can see the scaling errors in it. And if you apply a scaling correction to it, the system will now no longer look the same. It won't render the same, because the scaling is kind of controlling what's going on. And when you pull it back, you won't get the kind of nice effect that you had, albeit with scaling errors. And the scaling errors, you've seen them probably, they look really ugly. It's where you see bits of objects that don't render correctly. And one of the things you'll see is that, you know, when you're in your render selections here, you know, you look at it in draft and it looks like one thing, and you look at it in best and it looks like another thing. It's a wholly different kind of look. That means the scaling's not being calculated correctly, and the renderer doesn't know how to deal with it. So let's forget it for the moment anyway. We'll get to it at some point for sure.
Okay.
Because what I really want to do now is I just want to talk about some of the ways we can light things, and because there are a bunch of different ways of lighting things inside of Voyager. The most direct one that we all know is the sun. So this is Voyager Sun. Once we have our shadows switched on here, we have a light source that we can move around, and it can look at things from different directions. You can switch the shadows on and off. It will calculate a kind of rough shadow even when the shadows are switched off. These are kind of more true shadows. But you can still see that there is a shadowing happening here, even with the shadows switched off. And so for a lot of things, landscapes and so forth, you probably can get by without casting shadows, keeping in mind that when you put casting shadows on, it will take slightly longer to render. And particularly when you're in a Voyager landscape where you've got hillsides and oceans and particularly clouds, those things will start to affect the shadows. So when you switch shadows on and you're in a landscape with clouds, particularly with depth field clouds, it will calculate the shadows of those clouds. And so that can look great. You know, you can see a landscape stretching away and it's got all the cloud shadows on it, and that looks fabulous. But it'll also take you a lot longer to render such a landscape. Here, this is very simple. This is casting very simple shadows, and I'm going to show you when we go into these objects, there's a way of controlling what the actual shadows look like, and that is over here, how far the shadows get cast and how soft the shadows are as well. So from right down here, they're quite hard shadows. Oh, and also the actual shadow softness will depend on the object which the shadow is being cast on, as well as the object that's casting the shadow. Shadow softness is also calculated over distance. So when something is very close to a surface and you have the shadows as soft, they will be soft, but not as soft as if the thing is further away from the surface. So keep that in mind. So you can see here that the sphere shadow looks kind of hardish around the sphere, and that's because the sphere is actually sitting pretty close to that surface. If I was to move the sphere up, the shadow would become softer. So let's actually just do that. Let's just get back to this. I'll just get rid of these. Sorry about this. Is that our sphere? It's a box. I'm just going to put in a 3D offset tile here so I can just move this sphere. Oopsie. And I'll move it a little bit on the x-axis as well. Oops, on the way. Still not that soft there, but it would become softer the further away that I go with that sphere. You can sort of see it there. So check me out on both. It does anyway. Take my word for it. It will. The further you get away from the source, it will do that. Before, one of the things that we talked about very briefly before, I think Andy brought it up, was the ambient occlusion. So let me just explain what's going on here. We have, in this particular case, we have a relatively hard light source. We have the sun, and the sun is actually casting a hard shadow, just as it would if you were out in the sun in the middle of the day. So that's what you're kind of seeing there. But it is absolutely possible to have a situation where you want the sun to look soft. So we switch off the shadows here, and we have a thing called ambient occlusion. And what that does is it kind of emulates that very soft effect that you would get under an object in the middle of the day if you were standing under a tree or you had an overcast sky. So we'll switch the ambient occlusion on to everywhere. And that's the kind of effect that you get with ambient occlusion. It's that kind of very softish shadow that sits under something if it was an overcast day, for instance. And that ambient occlusion can also help with kind of bedding things into a scene, because everything has ambient occlusion. And you'll notice that if we switch the occlusion off, let's just switch it off again. And we'll put on our shadows again. One thing you'll notice here, let's move the sun around a bit. One thing you'll notice here, it's not so easy to see it when it's in the rough render here, but if you were to render this, you have your cube sitting on this surface, and it's got a very hard line there. And that hard line tends to make things feel like they're kind of stuck on and they don't belong to a scene. Ambient occlusion helps that kind of sort of soften that effect. So if you have ambient occlusion on, it kind of gives you this sort of like ambient shadow that sits around things. And in real life, that's what we see. So if you go out and look at something, there's always a little bit of shadowing sitting under things. And the object and where it joins to the surface, if you've got your ambient occlusion on, it just gives it that feeling of having the two surfaces feeling like they belong to one another. It's a really good way of kind of making something sit in a scene and feel like it sits in a scene. Now, ambient occlusion takes render time, so you should be aware of that. And the more complex your objects are, the more ambient occlusion will have an impact on your render. So keep that in mind when you're doing things. Sometimes it's entirely unnecessary to have it on, depending on what kind of thing you're doing. But for realism, it's very, very important that you do consider it. Okay, so that's the sun. Obviously, you can color the sun as well. You can switch the sun off just by having it go to black. And you can have different kinds of colors. Pretty obvious stuff. One of the things that I will explain here is probably going to be useful to you to know, and that is the sun is now off, so we don't actually have any light falling on these objects, but you're going to say, I can see light on these objects. Why is that? And the reason for that is that's the ambient level of the object. Now, when you have an object in a particular space, it's always going to have some ambient light falling upon it. So it's almost the light version of the ambient occlusion. It's ambient light. And that ambient light in Voyager is dictated by, usually by the sky that you have. So the ambient light that's falling on something is determined by the sky color. You have a way of actually changing how that works. When it's in automatic mode, it's actually going to come from the Voyager sky. But you can put an image in there if you want as well. And you can have a constant in there as well. The constant is driven from an ArtMatic system, but in this particular case, and an image is obviously a loaded in image, and it's quite a small image, but it can be really useful for doing things like if you have let's just say you had something that was inside a room and you didn't have the ArtMatic Sun, the Voyager Sun, you might want it to have some kind of ambience falling on your object. Now the sun is not going to be doing that, so by having an image in there, you could have a blurry image of the interior of a room, and that will then put that kind of ambience on your object, and that will help with a little, you know, heightened realism, if you like. You can control the amount of ambience on your objects also from inside the DF Objects preset using this control here. So let's just go to that, and if I wind the ambience up, you'll see it's now taking more ambient light from the environment. It still has a little bit of ambient light on it here, and I think that's because of this control. Yes, so this is the general ambient control for the environment, and that's controlling the ambience of everything. I'm pretty sure if I turn that right off and I turn this up, yeah, so that would give you direct control over the objects themselves. And this works at the same time. So it's basically the whole scene, the ambience of the whole scene. You can see these things are very important when you come to light objects because they really do help to give it some level of realism. If you just have one single light source coming from a direction, it's not particularly real because it's not the way that light works in the real world. And so having this kind of control over the ambience and the ambient occlusion gives you that sort of extra realism for your eye. Now, there's another way of using lights as well. There's actually a few more ways of using lights. We'll get onto at least one of them. And this one is from the lighting panel. So I've switched the sun off here. So the sun, even though it's switched off, it will have some control, some effect over what happens in the sky dome, but it's not really having any effect on the objects themselves, nor is it casting shadows, as you can see here. I can switch the sky completely to black, which means that there'll be nothing at all. So this is a really good way of proceeding if you really want to control the light in your scene and not have the sun interfering with the sky. And the way you would do that is you create your own lights. And to do that, you bring up the light panel, and that's just the command L, or just L maybe, yes, just L. And this allows you to select lights into your scene. This is a really, really important thing, and it's very underutilized by people using Voyager, and they kind of forget, or they're scared of it, I'm not sure what, but they don't explore this. But this is really the key to getting really, really good looking scenes, because you can control where your lighting is and how things look. And it's pretty simple. So you've got your 4 lights here, and you just have to activate the light. And you'll straight away see that a light box, a light square appeared there, but we'll put it over here somewhere near our objects. And we have to make sure that it's above our plane, which it isn't at the moment. You'll see the light came in on positions over here. So we want to have it above the plane. I can't remember where the plane was. Let's go 40. Okay, and let's show our light. So we can actually see the light as well if we want by having show light. It's sitting back behind our objects here. Let's make its attenuation. Well, let's bring it closer to the objects, in fact. So we'll put it there. It's behind the objects here. I'm going to make it even higher. Let's say 60, even higher. Oopsie, not too high. Now it's sitting above and behind our objects. Straight away, you'll see it's casting shadows. I can change its intensity to make it brighter, and I can also make it go further, cast its light further. So here I put in a light. It's sitting behind the objects and it's casting its shadow. I'll just bring it down so you can see it. So I can switch that on and off. That's the light switching on and off. And I can also make it really large if I want. So this is actually viewing a kind of a haze or a halo around the light. And this is sometimes quite useful because you can actually use that haze and that halo for various kinds of effects. And you can see that it's giving us a bit of contrast here from the background. Or you can switch it off and just have it as a direct light source, and it's just casting its own light and it's casting shadows. You can change the color, obviously, here. And you can also change the kind of light source that it is. So here we have what's called a point source. So basically means this is a light that's radiating in every direction equally. We can change it to other things. We can change it to an additional star, which basically makes it another sun. So in this particular case, it's now behaving like the sun in the Voyager scene. And you can also have that visible, so you can see it as another sun. And it will cast shadows and do all of that kind of stuff, just as, you know, just as the actual Voyager Sun does. Which means, of course, you can quite easily see you can actually have 4 suns if you wish, or 5 suns, including the inbuilt sun, if you really wanted to go wild on your alien planet. And the other thing we can do is you can have it as a directional beam. Now, this kind of behaves sort of like a sun, but you can place it and you can change the direction of that beam. So it's kind of like a spotlight in a way. Now, you can have as many of, well, you can have 4 of those lights. So we can actually just go across here and we can put in another one coming from the other side. Oh, it's got to be active. Let's make that up there as well. Let's make that also a directional beam. And straight away, I think you can see this is a great way of getting some extra realism into your scene. Now we have 2 light sources here. We can actually light these objects to be exactly the way that we want them to be. And that's a really powerful thing to be able to do. We can switch our sun back on over here. And you can see now we actually have a bunch of things going on here. We've got some light sources that we put in. We've got the sun. We can even now go back and put some light in our sky. And we now have some ambient light as well working on these things. And this has come a long way from what we first started with just 1 light source from the sun. This is now, I mean, this quickly just bunging things in here, but you can kind of see that with a bit of care, this can start to make your objects look very, very good indeed. Let's go 1 step further and we'll stick in our ambient occlusion as well. And both of these things. And that's quite a rich looking environment that we have there. So lighting is very, very important. One thing you should know about the lights is you can put them anywhere in the Voyager environment. So they are very, very strong lights. You can have them doing a very small amount of kick light on an object. So you might place an object in the scene and just decide it sort of gets blended in with the background. I really need to kick it up with some light, stick your light right there and make that object really pop from your scene. Or you can have a light that's casting a huge amount of light and you can put it up in the clouds. So it can actually become a light source in the clouds to illuminate. You know, might want to make a lightning, for instance. Stick your light right up there in the cloud and you can do that, and it can have a massive range. You can actually send its, let's just have a look here. We can actually make its distance, what's that, 20,000 meters. So it's actually casting its light a very, very long way. How are we doing for time here? We probably should call it quits, I guess, because we're kind of starting to run over. There's another way we can actually do lights. And that's we can actually put in a light, which is a depth field light as well. And the way that we do that is, I think Steve may actually have, Paul may actually have gone into this in his tutorial. But we can add another object into our system. In this particular case, I'm just going to pop a sphere in here. And let's stick one of those colors on it. So 1 in and 4 out. Ah, damn, keeps being hidden by the, where is it? 1 in 4 out. Where's my 1 in 4 out? It's still hidden. There we go. So I'm putting, I'm putting in a separate object over here, and I'll give it some color. So let's just make it really pink. I'm going to put this right down on the bottom here and show you something. So what I have done here is I actually have an object which is a sphere. It will be sitting right at world center. So let's just put in something. We can't see it because it's actually not joined into this system, but I'm just going to move it a little bit, move the offset a little bit. Which way do I want to go? That way. I think that's right, which will put it up here somewhere. And I'm going to go back into Voyager at this point. We'll get rid of our lighting panel here. And I'm going to go into my depth field objects panel again. And I'm going to switch volumetric opaque to opaque and light. Oh, so why can't I see it there? I should be able to see it there. It's because I didn't do it via there. Let me just check. Yep. Oh, that's why, because I'm on the wrong thing again. Simple sphere. Okay. I'm going, I will get a new, did you see then when I was on the plane, I don't have these options down the bottom here because it's looking for a second input to do light. And so if I switch on the sphere and then I go into there, you'll see now I have the option of putting opaque and light or opaque transparent. So what's happening is this stream down here is now appearing to Voyager as an extra option, what we call an X input. And it allows me to select opaque and light or opaque and transparent. So I can have an object which is both light or transparent. So now I think, could you see that there? Just above that there's a little bloom of light. It's actually added a light. And if I move the emission up a bit, quite a lot, probably too much. It's now added another light source, which is now sitting just above this sphere here. And casting, let's make that light another color actually. So you have too much pink going on here. Let's make it green. It's a bit hard to see, but you can see there's now a green light shining on the top of this and some green fill in here. So that's another form of light. And that's a controllable form of light from within inside of Designer. This allows us to actually have objects. So distance field objects, which are now lights as well. And they can be visible in the scene as well by adjusting the way how dense the light is. There it is. And these can be things that you can place in the scene as actual objects that are lights. And that can be really, really useful as well. So I think I'll call it quits there because it's sort of a good place to stop. And just ask if there's any further questions about these kinds of things. Does that kind of give you some idea of the many ways you can actually use lighting and how powerful it can be and how great it can make your scenes look?
Yes, it does.
One question I have in Voyager, if you close that panel, down the bottom right, the sky illumination, ground illumination, global illumination gain.
Yep.
How do they interrelate to everything you just described?
Okay, so they will have no effect at all in this scene because we don't actually have any planets or skies. If we had planets or skies, this will make a difference. So let me just save that and I'll make a completely new scene. And we'll put a planet in. and we'll put a sky in. And we'll switch our sun back on to a color. So we now have our wonderful planet A in here. Let's jump around somewhere in planet A. All right. So these things are there to control the way the illumination of the sun, of this sun, affects the terrain and the skies. So if I bring this down, it will drop the sky illumination down, including the light, the light on the clouds. The reason that it's there, I think, is because in some kinds of skies, so if you're using volumetric skies with a fair bit of cloud in them, it's possible for the sun values to really blow out the sky. So like that. And that's with the illumination pushed up, but even at the default, that one's going to blow out a little bit. But you see how it blows out all the sky detail? So if you push this down a little bit, it just gives you the option to have a little bit more detail in your clouds. That's the reason that it's there, I think. And it's the same with the ground illumination. So this controls the terrain, the illumination of the sun on the terrain. So if you pull this right down, it'll go darker. And if you push it up, it'll go lighter. Sometimes you'll find that to get certain kinds of scenes. So it's possible, for instance, to get quite a good overcast looking scene in Voyager. But to do that, you have to kind of tweak around with these values a bit, because you don't want, in an overcast scene, the ground doesn't tend to be as brightly illuminated. So you might want to pull that down a bit. The clouds probably down a little bit as well. And by juggling around the ambient light as well, you can get certain kinds of good effects. Nighttime scenes is another thing too, because at night, you usually in the real world, you get a lot more illumination out of the sky and maybe objects at night. So you may want to pull down your terrains in luminance just a little bit, because they don't feel quite right. You tend to lose luminance on the terrain if it's at nighttime. So that's why they're there. And the global illumination just grabs both of those things and brings everything down. So to be honest, I don't ever use it because I've never come across a thing where I could find a reason for it, but you could do it just by pulling everything down. And then the gamma controls the overall color of the scene. It's a very large effect. You can just alter your colors using that. I wouldn't do it very much. I tend to try and keep all my colors coming from the sun or my lighting sources, or from the way I design the terrain or whatever. But you can do it from there if you really want to. But this sort of thing is probably more useful for people who don't have any post-processing. You know, if they wanted to make a sunset scene look a little more orange, say, you can do an overall kind of push on the colors by doing that. So that's what that's there for, essentially. Anything else? So, and is there anything that you would like me to progress on to next week? Because we can, what I had intended to do is to go in next week and start to, let me just get back to that, what was it, profile suite, color objects. I was going to go back in and talk about some of the other things to do with the way we shade objects here and the uses of these. Talk a little bit about specularity and the way that works, because that's basically another kind of way of looking at lighting, another aspect of lighting, and a little bit more in depth into depth field stuff, maybe clouds and so forth was what I was going to go on to next time. And maybe look at the landscapes a little bit more and what we can do with landscapes and how you can control some of the aspects of landscape. But anything that now we're getting to that point now where there's just like this vast open field of things to talk about. So anything in particular that you want to talk about, I'm very happy to talk about those things. I will do a whole tutorial on fractals at some point, on 3D fractals. I probably won't go into 2D fractals too much. I don't really use Voyager Designer very much to do 2D fractals. There's so many examples in the example files that probably give you enough to talk about anyway if you really want to play with them. But 3D fractals, there's a bunch of stuff you can talk about, and I can show you how to start with very simple systems for 3D fractals and get into exploring them quite in depth and getting some really good results out of that. So that may be something we'll do in a few weeks' time as well. And I won't be able to do a tutorial next week because I have an electrician coming who's going to pull all my power out. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday next week, I'm not going to have much power. I'll be on and off, but I won't be able to count on it. So I think I'll have to, we'll have to skip the next one, unfortunately.